What languages are spoken in Africa? If you think the answer is African languages, you're not even wrong. You're just thinking too small. Africa has more languages than any other continent on Earth. More languages than Asia. More than Europe, the Americas, and Oceania combined. In fact, Africa's linguistic diversity is so staggering that linguists are still arguing about the exact count. The answer? Somewhere between 1,500 and 2,100 distinct languages, depending on how you define language versus dialect. At least a third of all human languages on Earth exist only in Africa, and yet, most of the world knows almost none of them. Today, we're going to fix that. Welcome to GriotWave Academy. This video will permanently change how you think about language, civilization, and Africa. Before we continue, it is important to understand the mission behind GriotWave Academy. This platform was created to preserve knowledge, culture, music, and stories that often go unheard or are forgotten. GriotWave is not just about content. It is about building independent systems of learning, creativity, and empowerment. Through books, audio, technology, and media, the goal is to transform timeless wisdom into practical tools for today's generation and future generations. Over 2,000 languages. That is the answer. Some linguists say 1,500. Some say 2,100. The disagreement is not because nobody is counted. It's because the line between a language and a dialect is genuinely contested. The famous linguist Max Weinreich said, "A language is a dialect with an army and a navy." Meaning, what gets called a language is often a political decision, not a purely linguistic one. But even at the conservative count of 1,500, Africa has roughly 1/3 of all human languages, and it covers 1/5 of the world's land area. Nigeria alone contains approximately 438 distinct languages. To put that in perspective, Europe, with 44 countries, has around 300 languages. Nigeria, a single country, has more. 7 major language families have been identified on the African continent. We're going to explore all of them. And by the end of this video, you will understand that Africa is not linguistically simple. It is, in fact, the most linguistically complex region in the history of human civilization. In 1963, the American linguist Joseph Greenberg published a landmark classification of African languages. His work identified 4 major language families, and while some of his specific subgroupings remain debated, the 4-family framework remains the foundation of African linguistics. 1. Niger-Congo, the largest language family not just in Africa, but in the world by number of languages. Around 1,500 languages, 700 million or more speakers. This family includes the Bantu subfamily, which alone contains 500 languages, spread across Central, Eastern, and Southern Africa, as well as Yoruba, Igbo, Wolof, Fula, and hundreds of others. 2. Afro-Asiatic, a family that spans Africa and the Middle East. In Africa, this includes Arabic spoken across North Africa, Hausa in West Africa, Amharic and other Ethiopian languages, Somali, Tamazight, the Berber language, and Tigrinya. 3. Nilo-Saharan, a disputed but useful grouping of languages spoken around the Nile corridor and the Sahel. Dinka, Luo, Maasai, Kanuri, Nubian. 4. Khoisan, the most ancient language group, the San and Khoikhoi peoples of southern Africa, speakers of languages famous for their click consonants. They represent humanity's oldest continuous linguistic tradition. And a 5th note, Austronesian, represented by Malagasy and Madagascar, and Indo-European languages brought by colonialism. These 4 families, 1 continent, 2,000 languages. Let's go deeper. Niger-Congo is not just the largest language family in Africa. It is the largest language family on Earth by number of languages. More languages than Indo-European, more than Sino-Tibetan, more than Austronesian. The family spans an extraordinary arc, from the Wolof speakers of Senegal on the Atlantic coast, across the vast West African savanna and forest belt, through the Congo Basin, all the way to the Bantu-speaking communities of East and South Africa. The Bantu expansion is one of the great demographic events of human history. Starting around 2000 BC in the region of present-day Cameroon and Nigeria, Bantu-speaking agricultural communities began an extraordinary migration that would ultimately place Bantu languages in 500 distinct variants across a territory stretching from Cameroon to South Africa. A journey of over 6,000 kilometers over 3,000 years. Every Bantu language shares common grammatical patterns and recognizable vocabulary. The word for person in Swahili is mtu, in Zulu it's umuntu, in Lingala it's moto, in Kikuyu it's mutu. The same root, proof of a shared ancient origin. Tonal languages, where pitch determines meaning, are linguistically sophisticated in ways that often surprise non-tonal language speakers. Yoruba has at least 3 tones. Getting a tone wrong doesn't just mean an accent, it changes the word entirely. It's a cognitive achievement that Yoruba children master effortlessly, and that adult-speaking European languages often find challenging to acquire. The Afro-Asiatic family is unique. It's the only major African language family that also extends significantly outside the continent into Arabia and the Middle East. Arabic, Hebrew, and Aramaic are all part of this family. In Africa, Afro-Asiatic encompasses one of the world's major languages, Arabic, plus a remarkable range of indigenous African languages. Hausa is particularly important and underappreciated globally. Spoken by 50 to 60 million people across northern Nigeria, Niger, and much of the West African Sahel, Hausa is the commercial and communication language of an enormous economic zone. Long before European colonialism, Hausa was the language of trade networks, stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Red Sea. It remains the lingua franca of the Savannah Belt. Amharic is the official language of Ethiopia, the second most widely spoken Semitic language in the world. Written in the Ge'ez script, one of Africa's ancient indigenous writing systems, Amharic connects Ethiopia's present to a literate tradition going back at least 2,000 years. Tamazight, the Berber language, is the voice of the Amazigh, the indigenous people of North Africa. For centuries suppressed by Arabization policies, Tamazight has seen remarkable revival. It became an official language in Morocco in 2011, and in Algeria in 2016. The ancient Tifinagh script, in which it is written, is one of the oldest writing systems on Earth. Nilo-Saharan is what linguists call a residual category, a grouping of languages that don't fit neatly into the other three major families. Whether they form a single genealogical family or several unrelated families that happen to share geography is still debated. But the languages themselves are extraordinary. Dinka and Nuer are the languages of the largest ethnic groups in South Sudan. The Dinka and Nuer conflict, the Sudanese Civil War, the formation of South Sudan as an independent nation in 2011. All of this history is carried in languages with ancient roots along the Nile. The Maasai are famous globally for their distinctive culture, their red shukas, their jumping ceremonies. But fewer people know that the Maasai language Ma has resisted centuries of external pressure. The Maasai have never fully assimilated linguistically, maintaining their language identity across Kenya and Tanzania with remarkable tenacity. And Nubian, perhaps the most historically significant of all the Nilo-Saharan languages. The Nubian kingdoms of Kerma, Kush, and Meroe were civilizations of extraordinary sophistication. The Meroitic script, still not fully deciphered, was the writing system of the Meroe Empire, which lasted 1,000 years. The Nubian languages spoken today by communities along the Nile are living echoes of those ancient kingdoms. These are not obscure tribal dialects. These are the languages of empires. The click languages of southern Africa are, in the opinion of many linguists, the most phonetically extraordinary languages on Earth. A click consonant is created by making a suction pocket inside the mouth, with the tongue, the palate, and the lips, and releasing it as a sharp percussive sound. English has no clicks. French has no clicks. Arabic has no clicks. If you've never spoken a language with clicks, producing them correctly requires significant practice. The four main clicks in Khoisan languages are written with symbols: alveolar click, palatal click, lateral click, and dental click. Languages like Kung have over 100 distinct consonants. English has about 24. But here's what makes Khoisan languages truly profound: their antiquity. Genetic research has shown that the San people of southern Africa carry some of the oldest human lineages on Earth. Their ancestors diverged from the rest of humanity, perhaps 100,000 to 130,000 years ago. Their languages may be the oldest continuously spoken language traditions in human existence. They are not curiosities. They are not primitive. They are not relics. They are living proof of humanity's deepest past, spoken by people who have maintained community, culture, and civilization for longer than any other continuous human tradition. And they are endangered. Colonialism, apartheid, and dispossession disrupted language transmission. Today, scholars race to document Khoisan languages before the last fluent elders pass on. Every language death is an extinction, an irreversible loss of human thought. If there is one African language that the entire world should know, it is Swahili, Kiswahili. With 150 to 200 million speakers across East and Central Africa, Swahili is the most widely spoken African language by total speakers. It is the national language of Tanzania and Kenya, an official language of Uganda, Rwanda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and a regional language used from Mozambique to Comoros. Swahili's origin story is one of Africa's great civilizational narratives. It is a Bantu language at its core. The grammar, the structure, the noun class system all come from the Bantu family. But over centuries of intense trade contact between the Swahili coast communities and Arab, Persian, and Indian Ocean merchants, Swahili absorbed approximately 15 to 20% of its everyday vocabulary from Arabic. Words like kitabu, book, sauti, voice, duka, shop, shul, school from Arabic kula, all have Arabic origins. This makes Swahili a linguistic monument to the Indian Ocean world's centuries of interconnection, an African language shaped by the most commercially active ocean trade routes in pre-modern history. In 2022, the African Union recognized Swahili as its sixth official working language. This was a landmark moment, the first time a sub-Saharan African language achieved continental institutional recognition alongside Arabic, English, French, Portuguese, and Spanish. Swahili has also penetrated global popular culture in ways most people don't recognize. Hakuna Matata, Simba, Rafiki, Ubuntu. Swahili words have entered the global vocabulary through The Lion King, through tourism, through the African diaspora. Arabic is simultaneously Africa's most widely spoken introduced language, and, in many communities, a deeply African language. With around 250 million speakers in Africa, Arabic speakers are as African as speakers of any other language. Egypt's Arabic dialect is the most widely understood Arabic variant globally, because Egypt's film industry, television dramas, and music have dominated the Arabic-speaking world for over a century. Whether you're in Morocco or Mauritius, Egyptian films and songs are understood. The Maghrebi Arabic dialects Moroccan Darija, Algerian Darja, Tunisian, are distinctive enough from modern Standard Arabic and Eastern Arabic that they are sometimes treated as separate languages. They incorporate substantial Berber vocabulary, French loanwords from colonialism, and in Morocco, even Spanish influence from the north. A Cairo Egyptian can understand a Moroccan at about 50 to 60%. Communication requires effort. What is often overlooked in discussions of African languages is the role of Quranic Arabic literacy across sub-Saharan Africa. In Senegal, Mali, Niger, northern Nigeria, Somalia, Tanzania, millions of Muslims learn to read and recite the Quran in classical Arabic. This created, over centuries, a pan-African scholarly class connected to the global Islamic intellectual tradition. The great libraries of Timbuktu, now partially preserved, contain hundreds of thousands of manuscripts in Arabic, written by West African scholars. African intellectual history in Arabic is barely translated. It is a vast archive, waiting to be read. Hausa is one of the world's significant languages, and one of the most underrepresented in global media and education. With around 75 million speakers, Hausa is not just the largest Afro-Asiatic language in sub-Saharan Africa. It is one of Africa's top 3 or 4 most widely spoken languages by total speaker count. If Hausa were in Europe, it would be the second or third most spoken language on the continent. The historical role of Hausa is crucial. Long before the British drew the borders that became Nigeria and Niger, Hausa-speaking merchants had created one of the most sophisticated commercial networks in the pre-modern world. The Hausa trading diaspora, communities of Hausa merchants in faraway cities, connected Saharan salt routes with Atlantic coast markets. Hausa functioned as the commercial language of an enormous economic zone. After the 19th century Fulani jihads, Hausa was heavily written in Ajami, Arabic script adapted for Hausa phonology. There is an enormous body of Hausa literature in Ajami that has never been fully catalogued or translated. And today, Kannywood, Hausa Cinema, based in Kano, produces over 2,000 films per year. It is probably the third most prolific film industry in Africa, after Lagos Nollywood and Francophone African cinema. These are films made in Hausa, for Hausa audiences, with production values that improve every year. Virtually unknown outside the Hausa-speaking world, which is itself evidence of how little global media attention African languages receive. Yoruba and Igbo are not just languages. They are civilizational systems. Yoruba is spoken by over 45 million people in Nigeria, Benin, Togo, and the diaspora, making it one of Africa's largest languages. Its tonal complexity, 3 tones where the same syllable at different pitches means completely different things, is one marker of its sophistication. But the deepest marker is the Ifa corpus. Ifa is the Yoruba religious, philosophical, and intellectual tradition encoded in a system of 256 chapters called ODU. Each ODU contains hundreds of verses, stories, prayers, medical knowledge, historical records, and philosophical reflections. A Babalawo Ifa priest memorizes hundreds or thousands of these verses. UNESCO listed the Ifa oral heritage in 2005 as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity. And then there is the diaspora. The transatlantic slave trade tore Yoruba-speaking people from West Africa and deposited them across the Americas. But their language, their religion, their music survived. Candomblé in Brazil, Santeria in Cuba, Trinidad Orisha, all of these are Yoruba religious traditions, maintained in the diaspora over 300 years, with Yoruba prayers still spoken in Salvador da Bahia and Havana. Igbo produced Chinua Achebe, whose Things Fall Apart is the most widely read African novel in history, a work that explicitly reasserts the philosophical depth of Igbo culture against the colonial myth of African primitiveness. The novel is, among other things, a statement about what is lost when a language and a worldview are destroyed. These are not minor regional languages. They are among humanity's great intellectual traditions. Ethiopia occupies a unique position in African linguistic history because it is the only country in Africa never colonized, and its linguistic tradition is the evidence of that sovereignty. Ge'ez is an ancient Semitic language that became the liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, one of the oldest Christian institutions in the world. Ethiopian Christianity predates Roman Christianity by centuries. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has used Ge'ez in liturgy, scripture, and scholarship continuously since the 4th century AD. That is 1,600 years of unbroken religious and literary tradition in an African language. The Fidel script, the writing system used for both Ge'ez and modern Amharic, is a marvel. It is an abugida, alpha-syllabary. Each of 33 base characters represents a consonant-vowel combination, modified to show which vowel. The resulting system of 231 core characters plus additional marks is complex to learn but remarkably expressive. And crucially, it was never imposed by a colonial power. It is indigenous. Amharic, written in Fidel, is the world's second most widely spoken Semitic language. When Ethiopia established its modern state, chose an official language, and determined that language's script, these were African choices, made by Africans for Africans. The Battle of Adwa in 1896, where Emperor Menelik II's Ethiopian forces destroyed an Italian invasion force, is one of history's great anti-colonial military achievements. And its consequence was linguistic, as much as political. Ethiopia kept its languages, its scripts, and its intellectual heritage. Here we must address the languages that most of Africa's population uses in government, education, and international business, the colonial languages. Through conquest, the partition of Africa at the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, and 50 to 100 years of colonial rule, European powers imposed their languages on Africa's administrative, judicial, educational, and commercial systems. They outlawed indigenous languages in schools. They made European language literacy a prerequisite for economic advancement. They created systems where you had to speak the colonizer's language to access power. The result, today, French is the official language of 29 African countries, the largest number of any language on the continent by country count. English is official in 26, Portuguese in 6. Together, these European languages are the medium of government and higher education for the majority of Africa's 1.4 billion people. But here's the paradox that Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the great Kenyan writer, articulated most powerfully. The colonial language is a weapon. It was imposed to subjugate, but it also became a tool of liberation. Fanon wrote The Wretched of the Earth in French to reach the world. Achebe wrote Things Fall Apart in English to tell the world what colonialism destroyed. Senghor wrote French poetry to assert African humanity. Using the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, that is the paradox of Africa's relationship with colonial languages. And it is not resolved. Ngugi himself famously stopped writing in English and writes only in Gikuyu, a deliberate act of decolonial sovereignty. Here is a demographic fact that almost nobody knows. There are more French speakers in Africa than in France. France has approximately 68 million people. Sub-Saharan African francophone countries collectively have over 600 million people. And while not all of them speak French fluently, the number who do already exceeds France's population and is growing rapidly. By 2050, demographic projections suggest that 85% of the world's French speakers will be African. This fact, increasingly acknowledged by the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie, fundamentally changes the question of what French is. Is French a European language that Africans also speak? Or is it an African language that Europeans originated? The political framework of French Africa, Francafrique, is one of the most controversial relationships in post-colonial geopolitics. France has maintained military bases in former African colonies, backed compliant governments, controlled the CFA franc currency system used across West and Central Africa, and maintained French educational curricula in its former colonies for decades after independence. Language was always part of this infrastructure of influence, but African French is evolving. Senegalese French has its own rhythm. Ivorian Nuchi, a French-based Creole spoken in Abidjan, has its own grammar and vocabulary. Congolese French sounds different from Belgian French. The language is changing in Africa, becoming African, and that process will accelerate as Africa's young population becomes the dominant demographic of the French-speaking world. One of the most damaging myths about Africa is that it was a pre-literate continent, a place of spoken word but no writing, of oral tradition but no texts. This myth is false, and it was deliberately constructed by colonial scholarship to deny African civilizational achievement. Africa has its own indigenous writing systems. Multiple. Ancient, sophisticated, and some are still in use today. The Ge'ez script, used for Amharic and Ethiopic languages, has been in continuous use for over 1,700 years. That is longer than the Latin alphabet has been used for English. Tifina, The Amazigh script is related to ancient Phoenician-era writing systems and has been used by Tuareg communities across the Sahara for over 2,000 years. Today it is being taught in schools across Morocco and Algeria. The Meroitic script of the Nubian Meroe Empire is still not fully deciphered. We have thousands of inscriptions from a sophisticated empire that lasted over 600 years, and we cannot read much of it. This is the African equivalent of Linear B, or the Indus Valley script. And Solomon Akante, a Guinean scholar with no formal Western education, sitting under a tree in 1949, invented a complete writing system for the Mande languages, Nko. He studied linguistics, identified the sounds of the Mande languages, designed original characters, and created an alphabet. Today, millions of people use Nko. Africa did not fail to invent writing. Africa invented writing. And Africa keeps inventing it. South Africa's linguistic story is one of the most extraordinary in the world. It is the only country to constitutionally recognize 11 official languages. That decision, made in the 1994 Constitution, the founding document of democratic South Africa, was deliberate. After decades of apartheid that elevated Afrikaans and English while suppressing all indigenous languages, the new constitution said, "Every language of this country is equal. Every community's tongue is recognized. No language shall be used to humiliate another." Whether South Africa has lived up to that constitutional promise in practice is debated. English still dominates government and corporate life. Zulu and Xhosa speakers still face disadvantage. But the principle is there, and it matters. Zulu has 12 million native speakers. The Zulu Kingdom, established by Shaka in the early 19th century, was one of the most militarily formidable states in Africa. The Zulu army's victory over British forces at the Battle of Isandlwana in 1879, destroying an entire British regiment, shocked the Victorian Empire. That victory was won by men who spoke Zulu, who strategized in Zulu, who sang war songs in Zulu. Xhosa contains click consonants borrowed from Khoisan neighbors. The and Agolm, that Nelson Mandela would have heard growing up in the Eastern Cape. Miriam Makeba, one of Africa's greatest music ambassadors, introduced those click sounds to global audiences. The language carries both ancient indigenous African memory and the legacy of South Africa's liberation. Before we talk about language endangerment, we need to talk about the griot tradition, because it challenges a fundamental assumption of Western civilization about what knowledge preservation requires. Western culture has tended to assume that written text is the only reliable way to preserve knowledge across generations. Libraries, archives, books, the written record. Oral tradition is often assumed to be unreliable, prone to error, mythologized. The African griot tradition challenges this directly. In many West African societies, Mande, Wolof, Mandinka, the griot is a hereditary specialist in oral preservation. A griot memorizes the genealogy of royal families going back 30 to 40 generations. They memorize the political history, the wars, the alliances, the judgments of kings, the biographies of heroes. They perform this knowledge through song, poetry, and narration. And they transmit it to apprentices, who will carry it forward. The Sundiata epic, the founding narrative of the Mali Empire from the 13th century, was preserved and transmitted by griots for 700 years before it was first written down by scholars in the 20th century. 700 years. Orally. And the versions recorded in the 20th century show remarkable consistency across hundreds of kilometers of geography. This is not a primitive technology. This is a sophisticated, specialized memory system. The griot is a living database. Language, in this tradition, is not just communication. It is civilizational infrastructure. If you are a builders, creators, entrepreneurs, purpose-driven individuals, the GriotWave inner circle is now open. Pause the video right now and scan the QR code to join the early interest list. We are living through a mass extinction of languages. And most of us don't know it's happening. Biologists catalog species extinction with urgency. The rhinoceros, the mountain gorilla, the coral reef. Language extinction is happening at a comparable or faster rate, and with comparable irreversibility. UNESCO estimates that roughly half of the world's 7,000 languages are endangered. In Africa, with 2,000 languages and enormous pressures from urbanization, colonial language education systems, and prestige hierarchies, hundreds of languages are in danger. The Khoisan languages are the most acutely threatened. Many have fewer than 10,000 speakers. Some have fewer than 1,000. And crucially, children are not learning them. Language transmission requires that children grow up hearing and speaking a language. If parents choose to speak only Afrikaans or English or Zulu at home, out of practicality, out of economic ambition for their children, then the minority language dies within a generation. What is lost when a language dies? I want you to sit with this. Every language encodes a unique relationship with the world. The vocabulary for plants, the names for types of wind, The grammatical structures for talking about time, obligation, possibility, these differ radically between languages. The Kung language has distinctions for types of animal behavior that have no English equivalent. When Kung dies, that knowledge, that way of observing the world, dies with it. We don't get it back. One of the greatest misconceptions about African multilingualism is that it's a problem, that a continent with 2,000 languages must be incomprehensible, fragmented, unable to communicate. The reality is the opposite. African communities have always developed systems for cross-linguistic communication. And many of those systems are not colonial languages, they are African languages. The African continent has produced a remarkable set of indigenous lingua francas, languages that spread beyond their native communities to serve as vehicles of regional communication. Swahili is the most famous. Hausa is arguably more strategically important for West Africa than any other language, indigenous or colonial. Lingala deserves special attention. It developed along the Congo River as a trade language, then became the language of the Congolese army under the Belgian and later Congolese state, and then became the language of Congolese rumba and soukous music, which has been the dominant popular music of Central and East Africa for 60 years. Lingala spread through music. Wolof in Senegal is a remarkable case of an indigenous language outcompeting a colonial official language in daily urban life. While French is official, Wolof is what people actually use in Dakar markets, taxi conversations, WhatsApp groups. Language lives where people actually speak, not where constitutions say they should. These African lingua francas are not accidents. They are achievements of communication, built over centuries of trade, migration, and deliberate choice. Language is not a neutral medium. It is not just a tool for transferring information. It is a civilization's operating system, the system through which a community organizes its perception of reality, its relationship with time, its understanding of personhood, its connection to ancestors, and to the future. Ubuntu, umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu in Zulu, means, a person is a person through other persons. I am because we are. This is not a slogan. It is an entire philosophical system about the nature of personhood, community, and moral obligation. It exists in language before it exists in philosophy texts. It structures the way Bantu-speaking communities understand what a person is, what society is, what obligation means. Sankofa, the Akan concept and symbol, means looking back to retrieve wisdom for moving forward. It is a theory of history, not linear progress, the Western model, but cyclical engagement with the past. This concept is encoded in the Akan language and symbol systems. It cannot be fully understood without knowing the language. The Yoruba lack of gendered pronouns is not an accident or an absence. It reflects a social reality in which grammatical gender is not a primary organizing principle. When you learn Yoruba, you stop automatically assigning gender to every person you mention. The language restructures your cognitive habits. This is what Ngugi W. Thiong'o meant when he called the colonial language a, quote, cultural bomb. The colonial language doesn't just replace a communication medium. It replaces a way of being in the world. It restructures consciousness itself. African languages are not primitive versions of European languages. They are different civilizational systems. Their preservation is a matter of human diversity, as important as biodiversity. Here is one of the most extraordinary stories in African linguistics, and in the history of human migration. Madagascar, Africa's largest island, 400 kilometers off the Mozambican coast. And its language, Malagasy, is not related to any African language. Its closest linguistic relatives are spoken in Borneo, Indonesia, 7,000 kilometers away across the Indian Ocean. How is this possible? The best current understanding. Approximately 1,500 to 2,000 years ago, seafarers from Borneo, possibly via the Indian Ocean trade routes that connected Southeast Asia with Arabia and East Africa, crossed the open ocean and landed on Madagascar. They found an uninhabited island and settled it. They brought their language. They brought their music, the valiha, a bamboo zither that is virtually identical to instruments in Borneo. They brought rice agriculture. And they built a civilization. Later, probably from the 10th to 13th centuries, Bantu-speaking East Africans arrived from the mainland. Genetic studies show that modern Malagasy people are roughly 50% Southeast Asian in ancestry and 50% East African. The language remained Austronesian. The genetics became mixed. This means that when you speak Malagasy, you are speaking a language that crossed the Indian Ocean. That preserved a connection to Southeast Asia across 2,000 years and 7,000 kilometers. Africa's linguistic diversity includes an Asian language. That is how diverse, how extraordinary, how globally connected Africa actually is. The mother tongue debate is one of the most consequential policy questions in African education, and it is mostly unresolved. The research evidence is clear and has been clear for decades. Children learn better in their mother tongue. The brain acquires cognitive concepts most efficiently in the language it already knows. When you make a child learn mathematics in a language they barely speak, as happens in most of sub-Saharan Africa, where children are educated in French or English from day one, you are adding a linguistic challenge on top of every academic challenge. The result is lower comprehension, slower development, and a permanent sense that school is a foreign language environment. But the practical argument for colonial languages is not absurd. Developing standardized educational materials in 300 different languages costs more than most African education budgets can afford. And the global economy rewards English, French, and Spanish proficiency. Tanzania made a principled choice: Swahili as the medium of instruction. Results are better at primary level, but the switch back to English at university level creates a cliff edge. Ethiopia's linguistic federalism is the most ambitious experiment. Each major regional language is a medium of instruction in its region. This has real benefits. Oromo children no longer have to learn in Amharic, the language of historical political dominance. But it has also, arguably, made ethno-linguistic identity the foundation of political identity, with destabilizing consequences. There is no perfect answer. But the direction is clear. African children deserve to be taught in languages they understand. The question is how to get there. Here is the story of how African languages conquered the world, and nobody noticed. The transatlantic slave trade was the most catastrophic forced migration in human history. Between 12 and 15 million Africans were taken across the Atlantic over 3 centuries. They came from different language groups: Yoruba, Igbo, Akan, Wolof, Fon, Bantu speakers from the Congo, and were deliberately mixed on plantations to prevent communication and organized resistance. But language is harder to kill than colonizers assumed. Enslaved Africans found ways to communicate through pidgin languages, through music, through religious practice. And the rhythms of African languages, the tonal patterns, the call and response structures, the polyrhythmic drumming traditions, entered the music of the Americas. Cuban sun music carries Yoruba rhythmic structure. Brazilian samba carries Bantu rhythmic DNA. New Orleans jazz, the origin of all modern popular music, is inconceivable without the African musical traditions brought by enslaved people from the Congo, from Senegambia, from Yorubaland. And today, Afrobeats, Burna Boy, Wizkid, Tems, artists whose music contains Yoruba, Igbo, and Nigerian pidgin phrases that are now heard in clubs in London, Lagos, Los Angeles, and Tokyo simultaneously. African languages are on the global charts. They are in the mouth of every young person who sings along. African languages did not stay in Africa. They crossed the ocean, carried in chains, and transformed human music. The debt Western popular culture owes to African languages is incalculable. Here is the good news. Because there is genuine good news. Africa is experiencing a linguistic renaissance. Driven by technology, by a generation of young Africans with historical consciousness, by cultural pride movements, and by institutional decisions, African languages are fighting back. The most important institutional decision: the African Union's 2022 recognition of Swahili as a working language. This was not just symbolic. It changed the operational logic of a continental institution. It says, Africa's own languages are legitimate languages of governance, of diplomacy, of continental decision-making. The technology story is extraordinary. The ENCO script, created by one man in Guinea in 1949, was added to Unicode. This means every smartphone, every computer, every platform that supports Unicode can now display Nico text. Communities in Mali, Guinea, Ivory Coast, and Senegal are creating content in ENCO: books, websites, WhatsApp groups. A script that a colonial power never recognized is now a global digital standard. Duolingo's edition of Yoruba in 2019 brought one of Africa's great languages to 500 million potential learners. Swahili has been on Duolingo for years. There are vibrant YouTube channels teaching Twi, Amharic, Hausa, Tigrinya, and they have hundreds of thousands of subscribers. Young Africans, second-generation diaspora in London, Toronto, Paris, are using these tools to reconnect with languages their parents stopped teaching them. A Yoruba grandmother in Lagos is now connecting with her grandchild in Atlanta through WhatsApp voice messages in Yoruba. Language revival is happening, and technology is its most powerful tool. Let me put the major languages in one view so you can carry this picture with you. Swahili, by total speakers, the most widely spoken African language, 150 to 200 million. Officially AU recognized in 2022. The language that carries East Africa's future. Arabic in Africa, 250 million speakers when you count all African Arabic speakers, the numerically largest single language in Africa, but fragmented into dialects so distinct that a Moroccan and a Sudanese may struggle to understand each other. Hausa, 75 million speakers, dominant commercial language of the savannah. BBC World Service broadcasts in Hausa to millions of listeners. Yoruba, Igbo, Amharic, all major world languages that receive almost no global recognition. Lingala, arguably the most underappreciated African language in terms of cultural impact. The language of Congolese music that has shaped the sound of Central and East Africa for 60 years. And Zulu, 12 million native speakers, perhaps 27 million total. The language of a nation whose military achievements, cultural confidence, and distinctive aesthetic have made it one of the world's most recognized African identities. These are not obscure tribal dialects. These are major human languages, spoken by tens of millions of people, with rich literary and musical traditions, ancient philosophical systems, and growing global presence. Africa's languages are not small. Africa is not small. Here is the full picture in one view: the 4 major language families and their principal branches. Niger-Congo, the giant. 5 major branches. Manda, the languages of the ancient Mali Empire and its successors. Atlantic, Wolof, Fula, Volta Niger, Yoruba, Igbo, Kwa, Akan, Iwe, Fon, and Bantu. Over 500 languages, 350 million speakers. This single language family contains more languages than exist in all of Europe, the Middle East, South Asia, and China combined. Afro-Asiatic, 4 branches in Africa: Semitic, Arabic, Amharic, Chadic, Hausa, and 200+ languages around Lake Chad. Cushitic, Somali, Oromo, and Berber, Amazigh, Tamazight and its variants. Nilo-Saharan, the disputed family. Eastern Sudanic includes the Great Nile Valley languages, Dinka, Nuer, Luo, Maasai, and the ancient Nubian languages. The Songhai languages, spoken around the Niger River bend, connect us to the Songhai Empire of the 15th century. And Khoisan, ancient, small in numbers, immeasurable in historical depth. The Khoi-Khoi and San languages. The click consonants. The oldest continuous linguistic tradition on Earth. This tree is not complete. It is a map of the territory, not the territory itself. Every one of those family names contains hundreds of communities, thousands of years of history, and irreplaceable human knowledge. Africa's language tree is the most complex language tree of any continent. And it is still growing. 5 myths, 5 truths. Myth 1. Africa has no writing systems. You now know this is false. Ge'ez is 1,700 years old. Tifina is 2,000+ years old. Meroitic may be 2,300 years old. Niko was created in 1949. Africa has indigenous writing systems. It created some of the world's first. Myth 2. African languages are dialects of each other. This is arguably the most damaging myth. It implies that African languages are imprecise variants of some common tongue, rather than fully distinct languages. Yoruba and Hausa share less in common linguistically than English and Japanese. They are as foreign to each other as any 2 unrelated languages can be. Myth 3. Oral cultures don't preserve knowledge reliably. The griot tradition refutes this entirely. 700 years of the Sundiata epic, transmitted orally, with remarkable consistency across geography and time. Oral tradition is a technology, different from writing, not inferior to it. Myth 4. Colonial languages are natural in Africa. They are not. They are here because of conquest, because of forced educational policies, because African children were beaten for speaking their mother tongues in school. That history is not distant. Many African elders alive today experienced it. Colonial languages are here as a consequence of violence. Recognizing that doesn't mean rejecting them. It means knowing what they are. Myth 5. African languages are dying out. Some are. But the overall picture is more complex. Swahili is growing. Hausa is growing. Afrobeats is spreading Yoruba. Technology is enabling revival. The trajectory is not uniformly downward. Your quick reference: Africa's linguistic landscape by region. North Africa, predominantly Arabic with Tamazight, the indigenous Berber language, coexisting and reviving. West Africa, the densest linguistic zone on Earth. Hausa in the north, Yoruba and Igbo in the south, Wolof on the coast, Fula across the Sahel, Twi and Iwe along the Gulf of Guinea coast, and French and English officially. East Africa, Swahili dominates as lingua franca, with Amharic and Oromo in Ethiopia, Somali in the Horn, and dozens of Bantu languages. Central Africa, Lingala along the Congo River, with French remaining dominant officially. Southern Africa, the Bantu languages of the Nguni and Sotho families, plus Afrikaans and English in South Africa. And the island nations, Madagascar with its Austronesian Malagasy, the Indian Ocean Creole languages of Seychelles and Mauritius, and Swahili across the Comoros. Every region is a world of languages. Every region rewards deeper study. 8 things you now know about African languages that you didn't know 30 minutes ago. 1. 2,000 languages. 1 in 3 human languages. The most linguistically diverse continent on Earth. 2. 4 major families: Niger-Congo, Afro-Asiatic, Nilo-Saharan, Khoisan. Each a world unto itself. 3. The Khoisan click languages are humanity's oldest. When you hear a click consonant, you are hearing the echo of the oldest human linguistic tradition still alive. 4. Africa invented writing. Ge'ez, Tifinagh, Nsibidi, Meroitic, Neko, multiple original writing systems. This fact alone should permanently retire the myth of African preliteracy. 5. African languages conquered the world. Through the horror of the slave trade, African linguistic heritage entered the Americas and became the foundation of all modern popular music. Jazz is African. Samba is African. Rock and roll has African DNA. 6. Swahili is now an AU official language, a landmark moment for African linguistic sovereignty. 7. Colonial languages are here by conquest, not by choice. Recognize them as tools, but know their history. 8. The revival is real. Technology is enabling language preservation and spread at a scale never before possible. Africa's languages are not a problem to be managed. They are one of humanity's greatest treasures, and they belong to all of us. Africa does not have languages. Africa's languages. 1/3 of all human speech exists on this continent. The oldest click consonants still spoken. The oldest continuously used writing scripts still read. The rhythmic foundations of jazz, samba, rock and roll, and Afrobeats. The philosophical depth of Ubuntu and Ifa. The griot memory systems that have transmitted knowledge for 1,000 years without a library. Every time you say Hakuna Matata, you are speaking Swahili, a language of the East African coast, a language of the Indian Ocean world, a language of enslaved people who were sold but whose tongue could not be sold. Every time you listen to a Beyoncé song with Yoruba rhythms, you are hearing West Africa. Every time you hear blues guitar, you are hearing the echo of languages that cross the Atlantic in chains and refuse to die. Africa's languages are not relics. They are not curiosities. They are not problems for development specialists to manage. They are among humanity's greatest achievements, proof of the human mind's extraordinary capacity to create, to transmit, to preserve, to transform. If you learned something today, share it. Tag someone who thinks Africa speaks one language. Tag someone who has never heard of the Gihez script or the Tifinagh alphabet or the Ifa corpus. Subscribe to GriotWave Academy. This is what African education looks like when it is taken seriously. Asante. Merci. Thank you. Before you go, help this message reach more people. If you learned something new today, like the video, subscribe for more deep dives, and share this with someone who still thinks Africa is a country. Small conversations can challenge big misconceptions, and every share helps expand understanding. If you want to explore this topic further, scan the QR code for additional resources, courses, recommended readings, maps, and extended discussions. There is far more to Africa than what can fit into a single episode, and this is only the beginning of a much deeper journey into the continent's history, cultures, people, and future. And if you'd like a deeper dive into any topic related to Africa or Pan-Africanism, leave a comment below and we'll cover it in a future video.